Okay, so thank you very much, organizers, for putting the paper in the program. I'm going to be talking about my paper, Matching and Agglomeration. And I know some of you may have seen the previous versions of the paper, but I'm now updating some empirical results and the model, which I'm all excited about getting your feedback. Right, so the starting point of this project is a simple observation that farms are more productive in more densely populated areas. And there's a broad consensus that a non-trivial fraction of this correlation comes from agglomeration spillovers. At the same time, there are many theories of the mechanisms of agglomeration spillovers, starting from Alfred Marshall more than 100 years ago. However, there's limited direct empirical evidence on each mechanism, as well as how it matters for spatial equilibrium and policies. And the last point is particularly concerning because we generally think that policy implication may depend on the micro foundation of the agglomeration. So what I'm going to do in this paper is to focus on a particular micro foundation of agglomeration, which is through supplier matching. So first thing I'm going to do in this paper is to document evidence of this type of agglomeration mechanism. In particular, do farms in denser areas benefit from faster and better supplier matching? And the second question I'm going to ask is, if there is evidence, what does it imply for the supplier matching? What does it imply for spatial economic activity, as well as the policy implications, in particular highway networks that I study in this paper. So the first section of the paper is to document the reduced form evidence. And to do so, I use the yearly panel of farm-to-farm trade in Japan, which has been used by several authors already, so you may be familiar with this type of data. And what I document first is in cross-section, farms tend to have more suppliers in denser locations. And so that's a suggestive evidence, but there's obviously a concern due to farm selection based on external input demand. And so farms in denser areas may be a type of farm which require more external suppliers for production. So what I'm going to do in this paper in the majority of the reduced form exercise is to focus on supplier matching after unanticipated supplier bankruptcies. So the idea is that these farms used to have a supplier, but suddenly lost one. So they are in demand of an alternative supplier. And we're going to study how quickly they match with a new supplier and how this rematching rate depends on the supplier density. And just to preview the results, I find that the supplier rematching rate indeed strongly responds to the density of suppliers. At the same time, second, I find that the density of other buyers does not decrease supplier matching rate. So supplier density seems to improve the matching rate, but the density of other buyers does not seem to decrease the matching rate, indicating that there is evidence of increasing returns to scale in matching. And the last finding is that being matched with a supplier, which is instrumented by supplier bankruptcy, significantly increases sales. So that means that being matched with a supplier matters for your sales. Okay? So it's important, there's a value of matching, but this value of matching is not significantly different across different supplier density. So it seems that the biggest benefit of supply matching is coming from faster supply matching rather than the value of per supplier match. So having these results in the back of mind, that the next question I'm going to ask is, what does it mean for the spatial equilibrium? And to answer this question, I'm going to build a model that incorporates diamond water synthesizer style dynamic search and matching framework in the intermediate goods trade in a standard quantitative spatial economics model. So just like a standard QSC model, it's going to accommodate rich location heterogeneity in productivity, amenity, bilateral trade costs, which is important because I want to later on want to do realistic policy counterfactuals. At the same time, the model adds the supply matching mechanism, and the supply matching mechanism endogenously changes locational productivity. Okay? So that's going to be an agglomeration force. And I'm going to estimate the structural model to fit the gravity equation, that's the cross-sectional feature of the data of trade flows, which is also predicted by the model, which is a nice feature of the model. And also the reduced form impacts of unanticipated supply bankruptcies, in particular the dynamic rate of matching and the impacts on sales. And equipped with the estimated model, I'm going to run two counterfactual simulations to highlight the first question. The first question is, the first counterfactual simulation is to hypothetically shut down this supply matching mechanism. So I'm going to assume that counterfactually, the supply matching rate does not respond to the supply density. And in this counterfactual world, I find that the dispersion of population density would be 20% smaller, which is confirming that quantitatively this type of agglomeration spillover has a non-treatable quantitative impacts on the economic activity in space. And the second counterfactual is the highway networks. And I evaluate the highway networks, welfare gains of highway networks that exist in Japan in two scenarios. One is with the mechanism of supply matching, and the other is the model which shuts down this agglomeration mechanism. And I find that the welfare gain almost doubles by the introduction of this mechanism. So it's quantitatively also relevant for policy. So for the sake of time, let me just skip the related literature and just go straight to the data in the reduced form evidence. Right, so the main data, again, has been used by several authors. Is a yearly panel of firm-to-firm trade in Japan over 10 years. It is constructed by a credit reporting company called Tokyo Shoko Research, which is it's an equivalent of Dun & Bradstreet in the US in terms of the business models. And it covers 70% of all firms in Japan, 90% of firms, about 5 employees in Japan. It has a high coverage, but it's not a census. And it covers all sectors, including manufacturing, retail, wholesale, construction, and so on. And a nice feature of the data is it reports up to 24 main suppliers and buyers each year, which is collected based on interviews or surveys. Okay. And so this is nice because I can study the cross-sectional and dynamic nature of supply matching, but there are two limitations that I should be say upfront. One is that it is only about the extensive margin. So I don't observe the trade volume in between two firms. So it's not like VAT data, which has been utilized in this literature recently. And the other restriction is that trade information is only available at the firm, but not at the establishment level. But for this, in the reduced form exercise, I can do the robustness exercise by restricting firms, which only have establishments in the headquarter locations. So there's a little bit more detail, but let me get straight to the cross-sectional evidence. So what I'm plotting here is on the x-axis, the population density, and on the y-axis, the number of suppliers per firm. And each dot represents a municipality. Yes, so you see that the strong cross-sectional correlation between these two variables, which is suggestive of the mechanism I am highlighting. But obviously, you'll be worried about alternative story, and I guess the first order concern is that it's driven by firm selection. Okay, so firms in dense areas are simply those types of firms which require external inputs for their production. So what I'm going to do is to study response to unanticipated supply bankruptcies because those are the firms which for sure has demand for external suppliers. So that leads me to the reduced form exercise. And for this, a nice feature of the data is it has the list of bankruptcies with their primary reasons. And from there, I literally pick the one labeled as unanticipated reasons, which covers 1.5% of bankruptcies, which is described as death of due to death of representatives, the natural disasters, and so on. And I'm not going to use other reasons, for example, sales decline or debt accumulation, because those are for sure endogenous to the buyer side firms. All right, so the basic idea, the basic design of looking at the impacts of supplier bankruptcies is the difference between matched control and treatment pairs. So here, I is the firm or buyer side firms, T is the year, and treatment takes 1 if firm I faces an anticipated supplier bankruptcy at some point. And G is the group of matched control and treatment firms, where the group is formed based on the same municipality of the headquarter location, and also have a supplier in the same 4-digit industry. Okay, so these are the firms. In other words, control and treatment firms are 2 firms which face the same supplier market, same local supplier market, I should say. And post is a post-treatment dummy. So beta is going to capture the difference treatment effects. And I'm going to include eta GT, which to make sure that the comparison is all made within the group between the control and treatment firms. All right, so that's the specification for the average impact of supplier bankruptcy. But as I alluded in the beginning, one important interest here is to what extent this matching rate with a new supplier, taking the new number of new suppliers as an outcome, depends on supplier density. So that motivates me to look at the heterogeneous effects with respect to supplier density. So now I have the term which interacts post-treatment and supplier density. And supplier density in the baseline is specified as the density of firms in the bankrupting suppliers industry, which has a buyer in the firm's headquarters in the baseline period. So it's a little bit mouthful, but what this is saying is that these are the firms which already sell to the treatment firm's location and also in the same industry as they face supplier bankruptcy. Okay, so those are likely to be an alternative supplier that they can replace them. And to make sure that this gamma is not driven by other dimensions of firm characteristics, I include Z control variables as an interaction with post and treatment. And for example, I include location fixed. I can include location fixed effect here to make sure that what I find is just a simple difference between the Tokyo and remote areas. Sorry, I'm reading Joe's question. I created a lot of. So in terms of so tsunami created a large shock, but in terms for the supplier density, it's not a large shock, right? Because it's not something like destroying a complete one city. If you know the context of Japan, it has recovered pretty reasonably quickly. It's true that some of them have exited, but it's not large enough to change the supplier density in a meaningful way.
Feel free to treat the questions in the chat as a record keeping device.
Yeah. I was thinking about it, but maybe it's better to clarify. All right, great, thanks. But you may be still worried about the endogeneity of supplier density, and this is one of the things that I'm updating right now, so I appreciate your feedback. So particular stories, for example, that a type of firm which faces higher supplier density is a type of firm which is good at matching with a new supplier or finding a new supplier. Okay, so even after controlling for location, industry fixed effects. So to deal with this, I'm going to prepare for instruments for supplier density. And the basic idea is to use the fact that firms care both the supplier access and buyer access when they make location decisions. So more specifically, what I'm going to do is instrument the supplier density. By that, evaluate at the firm's ideal location only from buyer access, only from their buyer access perspective. It's kind of leveraging the network idea. And in terms of, to be more precise, what I do is pick the most common industry BI or firm I among the firm's I's buyers. Okay, so think of this as the main buyer sector of the firm. And I'm going to identify the location and start where the firm density of industry B is highest. Okay? So this is the ideal location for the firm purely from the buyer access perspective. Okay? And I'm going to evaluate the supplier density at this ideal location from the buyer access perspective instead of the actual location, which is used in the OLS specification. So just to be explicit, the exclusion restriction here is that the only reason why supplier density at N star, again, this is the ideal location from the buyer access perspective, is correlated with ICE unobserved supplier matching rate through the supplier density at their actual location. Okay. So it's a little bit mouthful, and at least I have to think a little bit more about what are the potential scenarios where this exclusion restriction is violated. But for the sake of time, let me just kind of proceed, and I'm happy to go back, and if there are any questions about this identification strategy, I'm happy to discuss later on. But let me just show you the results to push forward, and I want to cover the model section as well. So here is the impact on the number of new suppliers of the supplier bankruptcy. So the first column is the average impact after 2 or 3 years since the supplier bankruptcy. Treatment firms match with supplier with a new supplier 0.26 significantly more than the control firms. So they do rematch with a new supplier, but this rematching is imperfect. And from the second column, what I show is the heterogeneous effect with respect to the supplier density. And the supplier density is normalized to be standard deviation 1 and mean 0. So you should be thinking of this as the impacts of the increase of the treatment effects by 1 standard deviation increase of the proxy of supplier density. Yeah. So it has a huge effects, and the effect survives even after you control for prefecture, industry fixed effects, as well as you do implement the IV design using the buyer access idea. Right, that's the first finding. And the second finding is that even though the supplier density matters for supply matching rate, the density of other buyers does not decrease the matching rate. Okay, so here, the first 2 rows are the supplier density as I shown, and the remaining columns are different proxies of the density of buyers. It's not obvious who are the other buyers. It's not like a labor market context where you can easily define unemployed workers. And I do several versions of this specification, and none of them seem to be significant. So while supplier density seems to matter, the presence of other buyers does not seem to affect the matching rate. So that I take as an evidence of increasing returns to scale in matching. All right, so this is the last slide for the reduced form evidence. So what I'm showing here is the results of this regression, where I look at the impact on outcome variables on the number of suppliers that the firm has in each period, instrumented by the treatment of supplier bankruptcy. So what this is doing is kind of trying to get at the value of having one more supplier on your outcome variables. Okay. So what I find is I find significant positive impacts of sales. So having a supplier increases sales, but at the same time, and sales is divided by the baseline. So you should be thinking of this as a 6% decrease per one more supplier. Sorry, 6% increase of sales per one more supplier. But this value of having a supplier does not significantly differ across the density of suppliers. Okay. So this seems to be indicating that the matching benefit is coming from faster matching rather than the benefit per match. So there's a question of no congestion. So let me just quickly say that. So there's a question from Tommaso that isn't it surprising that there's literally no congestion. One thing that I can say is that, so I think you are thinking of a labor market context where people typically find congestion effects. Okay, so and the matching function is constant returns to scale. But this is kind of like a different context. In particular, the difference is coming from the fact that suppliers can supply to multiple buyers simultaneously, as long as they can flexibly increase that production scale. So it's interesting finding, especially as a contrast to labor search and matching literature. But if you think about the context, I think it's more natural. Yeah, I can more about the empirical aspect if there are any more questions. But let me push forward. Just to summarize, supply matching seems to matter for supplier density. With increasing supplier density of other buyers does not seem to affect the supply matching rate, and being matched with a supplier seems to give you some value for production. So with these in the back of mind, let me get to the model. So what the model is going to be to have multiple locations, because I want to consider the spatial equilibrium. And there's a unit measure of people deciding their residential location, just like a standard quantitative spatial economics model. There are continuum of firms in each location, and all firms can supply to can be a supplier and a buyer at the same time. So when I say a firm, it's not that, or when I say a supplier, it's not that they have a typical, they have a particular role of as a supplier or a buyer. Any firm can be a supplier and buyer in this kind of a network context. And I'm going to explain the single sector model today, and you can refer to the paper for multiple sector extension. And in a single sector model, I'm going to assume that each firm matches with at most one supplier at a time, but the suppliers can be matched with multiple buyers. And in the extension of so it's a one-to-many matching context. And in the extension of multiple sector model, it's going to be one-to-many matching within each input sector. And time is continuous, and I'm going to focus on steady state equilibrium. Right, so let me start with production technology. So each firm has a Douglas production technology using labor and intermediate goods. Each of them, firm F, has exogenous productivity of phi, and also use labor as a factor and intermediate goods. So the unit cost is going to be a function of firm's productivity, wage, and intermediate goods price. And there are two ways to source intermediate goods. One is to directly match with a supplier, and the other is to produce in-house using local labor. Okay, so I'm going to be more specific about how this works. But before that, let me explain the distribution of the firms. Firm productivity follows power law. Okay, and you can think of this A tilde I, and this power law function has a shifter, has the same shape theta, that has a shifter which is going to depend on locations, which is going to capture different productivity at different locations. All right, so let me first explain the final goods market, which is sorry, Isabella writes right? So I comment, but I think I should just move on and I'll respond later on. Final goods market is standard. Final goods are tradable with iceberg cost, tau ij, for shipping goods from I to J. And they're gonna face representative consumers with CS utility, and they're gonna face monopolistic competition. And so it's a very standard assumptions. So what's interesting about this model is the search and matching component. Again, there are two ways to source intermediate goods. One is to directly match with a supplier, and the other is to produce in-house using local labor, where the unit cost is wage times some efficiency cost. And so first assumption that I'm going to make is a fraction delta of firms can ever match with external suppliers. Yeah. So this part is really not important for economic logic of the model, but it's going to be important for quantitatively to rationalize the discrepancy between the steady state matching probability, matching rates, and separation rates that you're observing in the data. Yeah, so it's more of a quantitative point. But if you are the firm which can match with which you can ever match with a supplier, and if you don't have an ongoing relationship with a supplier, they can search and match with a new supplier. And at the same time, if you're matched with a supplier, you cannot match with another supplier until the relationship is exogenously destroyed at rate rho j. Okay, so so there's no on the job search, so to speak. All right, so let me be more specific about the matching part. The firms without an ongoing relationship will draw a random supplier at rate Vj among suppliers whose unit cost net of trade cost is below your in-house production cost for intermediate goods. Yeah, so these are the pool of firms which have a potential gain of matching, because if you match, you're going to produce, you're going to use their inputs for production. And the matching rate is, I'm going to assume that it has a power function, power function form, and it depends on some constant scale parameter and the measure of suppliers with unit cost below in-house cost. So again, these are the potential suppliers which is more productive than producing in-house. And also, just to be more explicit as well, these firms does not have to be producing in J. Okay, so these are firms which can supply to location J above the unit cost of in-house production. And I'm also, it also depends on the geographic area. This is also just for the scaling, and doesn't it's not a substantially important part of for the economic logic. And the elasticity is lambda. So as lambda is large, the matching rate responds more to the density of potential suppliers. So lambda is going to be a key parameter, of course. And I'm going to assume that buyers have all the bargaining power, which essentially implies that unit cost pricing by suppliers. This is a strong assumption, but if you relax this, you have to solve the complete bargaining problem over the entire farm-to-farm network structure, which is, I don't know if anyone has been able to solve this type of problem. Maybe Ezra's paper is kind of close, but it's hard to track down, especially if I want to do aggregation. So that's the assumption I'm going to make. And so firms accept supplier match if the joint surplus exceeds the option value of weighting, and which is going to determine the threshold of supplier unit cost CEPR, below which firms are going to accept the match if they meet. Okay, great. Thanks, Ezra, for the time. All right, so the way to solve this threshold is to solve Bellman equations as standard. So what I'm writing is the Bellman equations for the value of a firm, which is matched with a supplier, what unit cost C. Okay, and it is a function, it's a summation of that instantaneous profit from final goods sales. Again, the profit only comes from final goods sales. And that's also a power function of the supplier's unit cost, which is kind of important for tractability. This is coming from the CS utility assumption and the Cobb-Douglas production function assumption. Okay. And that second term is the continuation value, the change of the continuation value if you get separated, where U is the value when you are without a supplier. And if you are without a supplier, you can still keep producing using in-house technology for your intermediate goods, but you also have a continuation value, the change of the continuation value, but because you are going to draw a new supplier at rate Vj, and your value may increase. And so a very nice feature of the model is that this is a power function, and this is a Pareto distribution. And the Pareto distribution is coming from the fact that productivity distribution follows a power law. So that allows me to explicitly solve these two equations, and you're going to get acceptance probability, acceptance threshold, and the expected proportional increase of profit if you accept a match. And I'm not, so this is, so the expression is kind of messy, but it's, it allows me to, if given all these parameters, you can actually pin down these, the AJ, CEPR, and the value of matching with a supply. And let me actually also mention like the one, so it's intuitive because Guzai is the, sorry, I think it's Guzai. Guzai is the discount discount rate of the firm. So if Guzai is high, firms are more and more myopic, in which case CEPR is the same as the in-house production cost. So they're going to always accept, which is kind of intuitive because they don't care about future value. All right, so so this, I should also say that this is one of the things that I'm adding to the paper now. I used to assume essentially Guzai is infinite and they always accept. So last component of the model is the free labor mobility, which is standard. Utility of residing in each location is a function of exogenous residential amenity, the real wage, and the dispersion force, which depends on the residents in this location. You can microfund it in many different ways, housing consumption or preference shocks or residential spillovers. It doesn't matter for, they're all isomorphic. And I'm going to assume that utility is equalized, which is going to give the expression for the population size in each location. All right, so just to summarize, the steady state equilibrium is determined by gravity equation of trade flow, search and matching, trade balancing, and free labor mobility. And let me highlight the two equations, the first two equations to explain the intuition of the agglomeration force in this model. So the first equation is just a standard gravity equation, which is denoting the fraction of inputs that are consumed or used in location J, which come from I, which depends on the productivity or some constant factor of the source location in the bilateral resistance term. And this the source location component is going to depend on the exogenous productivity of the location and wage, because it requires labor for input, but also an additional term because of that search and matching part. And it's essentially a function of the match probability and the productivity increase if you match and accept a match. And at the same time, this match probability is going to be a function of this gamma, because as gamma is high, it's going to, especially around your locations, that means that there are more potential suppliers which are productive and, compared to your in-house production technology. So what this means is that an increase of gamma is going to increase the matching rate, which is going to give a feedback loop to gamma I again. Okay. Or another way of saying this is that if there's a productivity shock in a location, it's going to increase gamma I, and to the extent that there's a geographic friction, it's gonna increase the supplier access term, which is going to increase the rate of matching. It's also going to change acceptance rate, as long as that response is not large compared to the change of the matching rate, it's going to increase gamma I furthermore. Okay, so that's the kind of the feedback loop that the model embeds. Okay, so I have 5 minutes, and I think I'm on time. All right, so the model parameter. So I'm going to take this model to the data. And there are some set of parameters which are standard in the literature, especially in the literature of quantitative spatial model, which I directly calibrate from the data or either from literature. But there are subset of parameters which are particularly related to matching. And those are the parameters which I'm going to estimate using the Japanese data. So I'm not even going to pretend that I explain all these details here that is written here. But the essential idea is to first estimate the gravity equation, which is, sorry, it's not that important. So this gravity equation, and once you estimate the gravity equation, you're going to get the supplier access term, which is going to, as I said, affect the matching rate. And so what you get is that after you estimate gravity equation, and together with the value of these parameters, is including the elasticity of matching rate, you can compute the steady state probability of a match and matching rate, acceptance rate, and also the value of matching with a supplier. And I'm going to essentially estimate these parameters so that the predicted statistics from the model is going to replicate the average supplier matching rate as well as the regression coefficients of the reduced form exercise, both average and heterogeneous impacts of supplier and unanticipated supplier matching and supplier bankruptcies. And I'm happy to clarify more if there are questions, but sorry, so this is just to kind of show that the estimated model replicates the reduced form regression patterns pretty well. It's not, I mean, it's not mechanical, but it's not super surprising given that I'm estimating parameters off of these statistics. All right, so I think I have 2 or 3 minutes. So let me show you some of the counterfactual results. And also these are a little bit preliminary because I recently changed the model. But you can see the type of idea that this model is useful for understanding economic feature. All right, so the first counterfactual is to hypothetically shut down the supplier access advantage. And in the model, what I do is, so lambda is estimated to be 0.36, but I hypothetically assume that lambda is equal to 0. Yeah, so the matching rate does not depend on the supplier density by setting lambda is equal to 0. And so the first, the left graph is what the left graph is showing is compare the baseline population density and the counterfactual population density of each prefecture. Okay. And the model is calibrated under the assumption that that true lambda is 0.36. So this the baseline is actually just a 45-degree line. And you see, what you see is that in the counterfactual, the slope would be flatter, and the slope is about 20% flatter. So what this means is that the dispersion of population density would be smaller in this counterfactual in a quantitatively non-negligible way. And there's also a similar point about the nominal wages. All right, so the second counterfactual is to evaluate welfare implications of highway networks. So what I do in this exercise is, so during this time period, there's really, Japanese highways are pretty much developed before 2000, between 1960s to 2000s, which is before my sample. So I have 1 minute, so I'll just wrap up. What I do is extract travel time with and without highways from Google Maps API, calibrate the model with bilateral travel time with highways, and predict a counterfactual equilibrium using travel time without highways. And I do this exercise under two assumptions, two scenarios. One is with the supplier matching elasticity being positive and shutting down this mechanism. And what I find is that aggregate welfare gains, when you set lambda is equal to the estimated value, is 649%. Well, if you shut it down, it's about 26%. So it's quantitatively an important margin to explain the welfare gains from policy. All right, so I think I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude by saying that this paper is about supplier matching as a mechanism of agglomeration spillovers. And I'll stop here. Should I collect?
Shall we start with Isabella's question?
Yeah.
Or any other question that you couldn't answer before?
Yes. Let me open the chat window.
Oh, I guess we can let Isabella.
You can answer your question out loud if you want.
Sorry, I'm opening participants.
Oh, Isabella can ask the question again.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, I was muted. Hi, Yuhei. Thank you for your presentation. I'm going back to the empirical results. Sorry for taking you there. I was just trying to think how should we think about the role of supplier density in an environment where buyers in high density supplier locations might value more the variety of supplier inputs. So it's very frequent that firms would buy from several suppliers in the same, even narrow 4-digit industry code. So one way to react, if one doesn't value the variety of supplier inputs, one way to adjust to the death of one of your suppliers is simply on the intensive margin. Is purchasing from existing suppliers that you have in the same industry. So I'm just trying to understand, is in that case the relationship that you're showing really about supplier density, or are we going back to the question of how different firms are in different locations?
Right. So I'm not, you seem to be making several different points.
Sorry about
that. All of which are kind of relevant for the question of whether it's not selection instead of the impacts of supplier density. So I think the first point you are making is like the structure of input demand, that density. Farms in high density tend to source more. And that's what I try to, the first order thing that I deal with this issue is to look at the impact of supplier bankruptcy, because those are the farms which used to source from the supplier, but now they don't have a supplier, so there's a demand. So it's not that they don't have a demand and they don't match. And the other thing I think you are saying is that if there is a possible response by the firm which source more from other existing suppliers, the intensive response. So it's not like your DAT data that records the trade volume, but what I can do is to look at the impacts on the existing suppliers of the firm and look at the impacts on sales. And find is that there's no impact.
So there's no substitution across suppliers?
At least at the level of the suppliers. You can easily imagine that this is a little bit underpowered because sales is an aggregate thing which not disaggregated by each buyer. But that's the evidence that I have.
Okay.
Did I answer all of your questions? I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think the bulk of it. Thank you, Yuhei.
Sorry. Yonsek raised a hand.
Yes.
Yes, thank you. Very nice work. I have a question about the role of inventory. This channel is important. I think farms located in less dense area may respond by having some more inventory of the intermediate inputs. Can we actually explore this channel in the data? And also maybe this could be the reason why in some of the regressions you do not find significant effect in the year 0 and 1 after the effect? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I think there are several things that I can say. One thing that I realized that I haven't, sorry, I should say that first, I think that the direct thing I should probably do is to use farm level data, some kind of proxy about the inventory, and if there's any response on the inventory by the shock. And that I'll think about that point. And in terms of the data, it's, the network is based on the question of main suppliers. And so it's not that you already have an inventory, so you are kind of like, you say that, oh, you are not the major supplier at this point, if that makes sense. So, so in terms of, there's a little bit tricky point to address by just using the observed data in this data set. What is the likely response for the inventory? Or another way of saying is that it's hard to tell from the data what, for each specific pairs, what are the nature of the inventories. Hope that answers that question. Johannes?
Hi, so slight variation of Young's question is, maybe I have an alternative supplier from the same industry that I've been cut off, and that's kind of a way of insuring myself. And I think that's something that you might be able to check with the data. And more generally, I mean, I could think of many different ways how to, deal with this problem of losing the supplier. But so if I do the task myself, like what you assume in the model, should I not use a different input maybe in the production process? I mean, I'm probably not going to do everything to the very upstream, right? The whole value chain. So is that not something that you should be seeing in the data then?
So I guess, so let me first speak about the model. The model is, I explained just the one sector model, but the multiple sector models are going to be, going to have Cobb-Douglas production function for each input sector. So there's no, like, you cannot really use other sectors inputs for another sector. So that's kind of a model assumption. And in terms of the empirical point, I think what I would be able to say most strongly is the response that I gave to Isabella, which is that there doesn't seem to be a strong substitution effects with the existing suppliers. So I don't think that is a type of task that is easily substituted to other suppliers, at least within the context that I'm looking at.
I have a quick question. You started with the motivating fear about the relationship in the data, the reduced from relationship, and I just said, well, this might be selection, not. I guess two questions. How much of your story can account of that relationship, and also, I guess we also will be interested in understanding the selection. How much, I guess, firms select places with density because of the type of technology and so on and so forth. So I see both questions be interesting. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so I guess, so right now, so you're right that so in the structural model, the theoretical model, I'm shutting down the selection effect. And one possible way to, so there's not really a sense in which I can kind of compare these different mechanisms. But one thing I can potentially do is to change this eta, which is the average matching rate, or maybe, sorry. Yeah, this delta term, the fraction of firms which can source from external suppliers to depend on locations. And if I introduce those margins, then I can compare the variation, how much of the variation of the supplier matching rate that is observed in the data is coming from this delta or eta term as opposed to that.
But currently, how much do you account for? That one you can calculate it, I presume.
You can calculate them.
How much of the relationship in the data can you account by your model? Okay, because you calibrate your model based on these IB
Right.
terms, so then the model will generate a relationship.
I think where I sort of understand where you're going, and I think so. The only thing I showed today, and I managed to produce today, is this kind of fit table with the reduced form dynamic evidence. But I think what you're kind of getting at is if I fit, how much of that does my model explain the cross-sectional variation of supply? Yeah. And again, like. So I should first of all, I should probably look at that. And second, if it doesn't look great, I'll have to introduce.
No, it looks well. Look whatever it looks. Maybe it's 10%, maybe it's 100%,
yeah.
maybe it's 150%. Who knows?
Right,
but it would be nice to put in perspective.
Yeah, but I see what you mean. Thanks.
I had a question of just trying to think of this in terms of its relevance for developing countries. I know that the model you didn't show us, there's a multi-sector model, but in the empirics, did you look at any, like how this, basically like the lambda coefficient varies across industries?
So it's, yeah, so the only, so I'm a little bit underpowered. So this is a little bit old result, so I'll have to update that with the current regression specification. Yeah, so it seems that, so it's a little bit underpowered, but if you compare the bankruptcy when the supplier is manufacturing versus no manufacturing, the rematching seems to be faster for non-manufacturing sector. And part of the reason is coming from the fact that in the case of manufacturing bankruptcy, there's insignificant, but some positive impacts on exit. And obviously if you exit, you cannot match with a supplier. So, but I can look into more heterogeneity if that is of interest.